In December 1832, a chemist named James Marsh stood before a jury in the county of Kent and tried to explain what science had found in a dead man's coffee. He had extracted residue from George Bodle's stomach and from the cup that had been his last morning meal. The residue, he told the court, contained arsenic. But the samples Marsh had prepared began to deteriorate before the jurors could inspect them clearly, and the jury, unaccustomed to chemical testimony, was unconvinced. John Bodle, the old man's grandson and the prime suspect, walked free. The killer had escaped because science could not speak clearly enough in court. Marsh left that courtroom with a question he could not set aside. What if a chemist could make arsenic visible, permanent, and undeniable? That question would change the history of murder. By the 1830s, arsenic trioxide had been available across Britain and Europe for decades, sold openly in pharmacies and hardware shops as rat poison, mixed into wallpaper dyes, and dusted onto agricultural fields. It was colorless, nearly tasteless, and dissolved readily in warm liquid. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning mimicked cholera or a virulent stomach fever, conditions that killed so often in the 19th century that a doctor rarely looked further. Across France, the substance had acquired a name that tells you everything about its reputation: poudre de succession, inheritance powder, because it was said to be the means by which impatient heirs accelerated their good fortune. Insurance fraud, domestic disputes, the removal of inconvenient relatives. Arsenic was, for a time, the perfect method, and the courts had almost no reliable way to prove it had been used. James Marsh was born in 1794, and by his 30s had established himself as a chemist at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, a sprawling military manufacturing site on the south bank of the Thames in southeast London. His work there was largely practical, testing materials, advising on chemical questions for the British Army, and supporting the work of the Royal Military Academy nearby. He was not famous. He was precisely the kind of careful, methodical man that institutions rely on and histories tend to overlook. His name appears only occasionally in the scientific correspondence of the period. But when the Bodle family's tragedy arrived in the autumn of 1832, he was already familiar with the chemistry of arsenic, with the existing tests for it, and with their frustrating limitations. He would spend the next 4 years turning that frustration into a method that would outlast everything else he ever did. On the morning of the 21st of October 1832, the Bodle household at Plumstead in Kent gathered for breakfast. George Bodle, an elderly farmer and the patriarch of the family, drank his coffee and fell violently ill before the day was out. He died within days. The symptoms, severe stomach cramping, persistent vomiting, and a rapid collapse of strength, were consistent with the cholera-like presentation that arsenic produced in the body. A local surgeon grew suspicious. An inquest was opened. Suspicion settled quickly on John Bodle, the old man's grandson, who stood to inherit the farm. A search of the property produced what appeared to be arsenic in suspicious locations, and a remnant of the fatal coffee was preserved. James Marsh, called in as the expert analyst, confirmed what his tests suggested. Arsenic was present in the sample. The question was whether a jury would believe him. The difficulty Marsh faced was one that all early forensic chemists confronted. The existing method for detecting arsenic involved generating a precipitate, a yellowish compound called arsenic sulfide, and presenting it to the court. But precipitates degraded. They changed color in air, lost clarity, and could be confused with other substances by a jury that had no scientific training. When Marsh displayed his samples to the Kent jury in December 1832, they had already lost the sharp appearance he needed. The jurors looked at a deteriorating chemical preparation and could not be expected to accept it as proof beyond reasonable doubt. John Bodle was acquitted. The law required evidence that a layman could see and trust, and Marsh had found the poison but could not make the jury believe what he knew. That failure was precise, technical, and solvable. He went back to his laboratory. John Bodle lived for many more years after his acquittal, and in that time, according to accounts that circulated within the scientific community, he eventually admitted to the crime. Some reports hold that he confessed to Marsh in person, though the exact circumstances were never formally recorded. Whether or not Marsh heard those words directly, the knowledge that a murderer had walked free, because chemistry could not make its case, was not an abstraction. It was an institutional failure. British courts in the 1830s were unprepared to evaluate scientific testimony, and the science itself was insufficiently precise for the courtroom. Both problems needed to be solved before justice could reliably catch a poisoner. Marsh resolved to address the one he controlled. The other would require a different country, a different court, and a different chemist standing at the front of the room. Working in the laboratories at Woolwich over the years that followed, Marsh focused on a process that chemists had known about and outlined for some time: the reduction of arsenic compounds to arsine gas, produced by combining the suspect sample with hydrogen generated through the reaction of zinc with dilute sulfuric acid. If arsenic was present in the sample, it would be carried along in the gas stream. What Marsh refined was the critical second step. He passed the gas through a heated glass tube, where the arsen decomposed and deposited a metallic film on the interior surface of the glass. That film, a distinctly silvery black coating that came to be known as the arsenic mirror, was stable. It did not deteriorate in air. It could be examined at leisure, carried to a courtroom, and set before a jury without losing its character. It was visible, permanent, and chemically unmistakable. In 1836, Marsh published his method in the Edinburgh New Philosophical Journal. The paper described a reliable means of separating and detecting arsenic, even in very small quantities, and it attracted immediate attention from chemists across Europe. Translated descriptions began circulating in France and Germany within a few years. The test was extraordinarily sensitive, capable of detecting traces of arsenic that all previous methods would have missed entirely. Crucially, it produced a physical exhibit, the arsenic mirror itself, that could be shown to a court. It was not an interpretation or an expert opinion standing alone. It was an object. For the first time, the chemistry of arsenic poisoning could produce something a jury could see with its own eyes and a judge could examine in hand. The legal world had not yet caught up with what the laboratory could now offer, but the instrument was ready and the procedure was published. In August 1839, a young Frenchwoman named Marie Capel married Charles Lafarge through a matrimonial agency after a period of financial difficulty in her own family. Charles owned an ironworks at Le Glandier, an estate in the Cour-Easy district of south-central France. Marie arrived to find the property considerably less impressive than the correspondence had suggested, and the marriage was not, by most contemporary accounts, a happy one. In the weeks that followed the wedding, Charles fell ill while traveling on business after receiving food sent to him by Marie. He returned to Le Glandier in early January 1840 and did not recover. On the 14th of January 1840, Charles Lafarge died. A servant had already reported seeing Marie purchase arsenic at a local pharmacy, and suspicion fixed on her almost immediately. French authorities opened a criminal investigation. The case became a national sensation. Marie Lafarge was educated and articulate, and she maintained her innocence with a composure that some observers found compelling and others found unsettling. The French press covered every development. Local chemists were called in to test the contents of Charles's stomach and the food she had prepared, but their results were contradictory and inconclusive. The prosecution took an unusual step. They summoned Mathieu Orfila, dean of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris and the foremost toxicologist in Europe, to take over the analysis. Orfila had spent his career building a systematic science of poisons and their effects on the human body, and his published treatise on toxicology was the reference standard across the continent. He arrived at Toulay in the autumn of 1840 with the Marsh apparatus, the published procedure, and the authority of the most prestigious forensic voice available. Orfila ordered the exhumation of Charles Lafarge's body. Using the Marsh test on tissue taken from the remains, he demonstrated the presence of arsenic at a level consistent with deliberate poisoning. The result was not an ambiguity or a trace reading. It was a clear arsenic mirror, produced under controlled conditions in front of witnesses. He then took the additional step of testing the soil immediately surrounding the grave to preempt any argument that arsenic had leached into the body from the ground after burial. The surrounding earth showed no arsenic. The defense had no credible scientific counter to offer. Marie Lafarge was convicted of poisoning her husband and sentenced to penal servitude for life. The Marsh test had, for the first time in legal history, secured a murder conviction through reproducible quantitative chemical analysis. The courtroom at Toulay in 1840 was a different world from the courtroom in Kent in 1832. Marie Lafarge was released from prison in 1852, gravely ill with tuberculosis, and died in September of that year, still insisting on her innocence. James Marsh had died 6 years earlier, in 1846, never having witnessed the full international reach of the test he had built in the Woolwich laboratory after a Kent jury had failed to understand him. The Marsh test remained in active forensic use for more than a century, until more precise spectrometric methods eventually supplanted it. But the principle it established, that a trained chemist could produce in court a physical exhibit that was both visually conclusive and scientifically reproducible, became the foundation on which all of forensic toxicology was built. The question Marsh had carried out of that December courtroom in 1832 had been answered. Arsenic could be made visible. The era in which a poisoner could rely on the limitations of chemistry was over.